Hello and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, a podcast for people who care about environmental sustainability and climate action. I'm your host, Deval Bazi. I am delighted to welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Miss Nneka Matthews. Nneka, you brought up the topic of limits to growth. In August of this year, we celebrated Earth Overshoot Day. And I guess celebrated is the wrong word because it's nothing to celebrate because that represents the date by which we would have exceeded the Earth's budget.
Yeah.
So right now we're operating on a deficit in terms of ecological resources. So can you imagine that you get paid at the end of the month and by midway through the month you have depleted all of your money?
I think that happens to a lot of people. It's more common than you think.
Just think about the devastating impact on the individual and you personally, and then
you'll never catch up.
Right, and exactly, you're in debt, you're in a cycle of debt. This is where the earth is. This is where the planet is by our unsustainable ways of living, our unsustainable industry, society.
Well, it's how all our economic models were built. I mean, a lot of the biggest companies in the world that we're aware of today started off when there was an abundance of everything. There weren't as many people. The world was not as well populated as it is now, right? In addition to that, not everybody had money to buy things. You know, like I know in my parents' generation, they weren't always going to buy something. Like in our generation, as soon as we think we want something, we go out and buy it. But their generation wasn't like that.
The rise of consumerism.
Yeah. So from 100 years ago, when really nobody had money, what you would have had, somewhere to stay and something to put on and something to eat, but you weren't running around buying things. Yeah. Your purpose of having work to do wasn't so that you could buy stuff. It was so that you could live, so that you could eat and, be reasonably safe.
Yeah. I mean, that came up in another episode in season 1 when I was discussing sustainable fashion and in terms of our addiction to things and the intense materialism and consumerism and the impact it's having on the planet. Yeah.
But my thing is that I don't, we put so much effort on the consumers pushing that because, this idea that, well, if the consumers want it, that's what's pushing the companies to produce it. And therefore, when all of us take a stand and we have more conscious behavior, that things can change because the companies will, of course, produce different things.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another side to it, which is that these companies started when there was more resources available. And so their business model is that. I read a study, I would love to remember where, but I read a study that most of the big companies that we've known up to now will probably not be here in the next 15, 20 years.
And maybe they shouldn't.
Yeah. And that's the thing. So if that's true, I remember, I think it was last month, there's probably only one energy company remaining on the Dow Index in the States, right? It's been replaced by mostly health companies, tech companies, etc. Right?
Yes, I read that.
I think that, there used to be more energy companies on there, but that's kind of dropped off now. So that if that's what we're looking at, just with those two examples, it means that there's a switch that's about to happen. There's a change. And if we don't decide what that change is going to look like, we're going to be stuck with whatever we got. Now, the interesting thing is because we are in Trinidad and Tobago, this is a small nation and it's a developing nation. And so we don't have companies that, have that impact outside in the world. Some of them have a footprint here, but we certainly don't own those companies, which sort of, I think, makes us a little bit lazy because we kind of lay back and say, well, we'll wait and see what will happen, right? And then we will trump and follow suit. But
essentially, that's what we're doing.
but I think we have so much ability to be able to create a future for ourselves. Not in everything, right? There's a lot of things that we have to partner. We probably have to piggyback off of larger partners that have capabilities that we don't have, and certainly financial capabilities, because raising finance in the Caribbean is an issue, especially private finance for big projects, right? But there are other things that we can do if we think a little bit further into the future. So that one of the things that bothers me a lot in the energy sector is that we have an energy sector that, because it's government run, we are only planning at the most 10 years at a time. And this sector, if we think of all the international oil and gas companies that operate here or don't operate here, but maybe used to, they are not looking at this energy transition for only 10 years. These companies want to be here in 100 years. That's the type of industry it is. And so to me, that's the way it needs to be managed, in this kind of way that has such a long-term horizon. Now, I know that the individuals in our energy sector have a long-term horizon. Almost everybody working in the energy sector expects to have Trinidad and Tobago have an energy sector that is viable. Over the long term, we all want that. I don't know if we're necessarily set up in the best way to do that, because if we look at areas like, for example, technology is a big thing. It's even bigger of an issue now than it would have been 20 years ago, right? But we don't own the technology, even though we've been in oil and gas for so long. And there's new stuff that's going to come up. And I think just in this transition, I think this is a great time for us to get a little up the ownership aspect of the technology in whatever ways we can.
Yeah, I fully agree. Because when you look at, let's say, BP's outlook, their projections are out into 2050. And you wonder if persons who lead our local energy sector are planning for the different options or the different scenarios into 2050. Or, as
that would be a little bit difficult, just because it's around the election cycle. I think NGC is a fantastic company because it operates like a private company, and therefore I'm sure NGC has longer term horizons, right? But outside of that, I mean, Heritage may be operating more like that now, because the arrangements would have been changed a bit, and that's the kind of direction that we have to go.
But our policy has to go in that direction as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's correct.
I think our policy should be a bit more proactive, as opposed to waiting to see what the majors do and then kind of catching up with that.
Yeah. So that is actually, to me, I think that's a technology issue as well. I mean, there's other factors in there. But the technology is a big one because of the time that we are in. A lot of the sustainability problems that we are having, when I say we, I mean the whole world, right, affect economics, whether it's the economics of business or the economics of nations. We're running up against certain problems that affect how much money you can make, how much profit you can make. And a lot of these solutions that are being proposed to deal with that are technological. And so the technology part of it is going to be really, really important. So if you're trying, for example, to change the policies for how we would go about maybe doing an energy transition, maybe what types of energy we use, and thinking about how we want our entire energy system to be in the future, you can't really start to think about that in a realistic way unless you have data and tools to process it. And R&D. If I think about it, I don't even know if we necessarily have to go as far as R&D. I mean, if we just start collecting and processing data, and we have a lot of people that are coming out of universities with good degrees, right, and have the ability to do many things. And
definitely our policy should be data-driven.
It should be, yeah. And the thing is, if you think about it, every time we've had a change of government, and somebody new had to come into the energy sector and kind of figure out what's going on, they commission a study. We can't do this study. Could you imagine? We've been in oil and gas so long.
And we have to get a foreign consultant.
We have to get a foreign. And that's not the only thing. By the time they're done with the study, because it's going to take, a year, 2 years finish the study and get, the report done and present it to people and stuff. The way the world is changing at this kind of pace, you can't wait that long for data.
Yeah, it's obsolete.
Because remember, somebody from the outside, it's going to take a while for them to get up the learning curve of how things work in your country, especially if you don't have a repository that they could just pull the data that they need. Because it's one thing for our agencies and ministries to be storing data and looking at certain things, recording certain things. It's another thing to have data that's actually useful, like in terms of how the industry operates in the rest of the world, how certain kinds of decisions are made, what kind of parameters are being looked at. And in a lot of instances, we are looking at traditional bits of data that worked in a world that was a little more stable, but a very dynamic world that we live in today. Because if you don't have that, even if you get the best consultant, by the time they figure out what they need, in the first place, they wouldn't be able to create as sophisticated models because there's going to be bits of stuff that they really need that's missing. So they're not going to be giving you the same type of assessment that they would give a multinational, for example, an IOC that actually has certain kinds of data readily available. That's the first thing. And the second case, by the time it gets to you, it's obsolete because the world is just moving that fast. So how are you going to plan a long-term strategy for your energy sector in this transition?
And the issue of data is so important, not only for conventional sources, but even in terms of we want to develop renewables. Solar is a bit easier, but in terms of wind, if you want to attract developers for wind, you need to have data. Yeah. You need to at least have a year of wind data.
Yeah.
So that when persons are bidding or they're proposing from a place of knowledge and understanding of the local context.
Yeah. And the question underneath all of these things is, even if we wanted to do all these things, because we could make a wish list, right? But the question is, where does the money come from to do it? So that when you talk about transitions, one of the ideas is that when you had the oil and gas money, you were supposed to invest it in a way that would allow you to develop other sectors of the economy so that you can eventually shift away from this total dependence on the fossil fuels to other performing sectors of the economy. And we do have sectors of the economy outside of hydrocarbons that are producing. Well, that's a whole other episode to talk about, I guess.
Yeah, we have been hearing about that D word for a long time, diversification. But, to see it actually materialize.
Well, because, so the thing about diversification, I've heard people say a lot of things about it, none of which really makes sense to me, because in the first case, diversification is a long-term thing. And when you have an election cycle that's, 5 years at a time, and you have pretty much everything in the economy kind of depending on that 5-year cycle, like we don't realize it, but the country doesn't run just like that. There are countries where everything runs, and then whoever you put in power just makes decisions about where things get allocated. That's not how this country is. If whoever is in charge is running the country, that's how it is here. The country doesn't just run in the background.
Our policy shifts according to who is in power.
Exactly, and it's a problem most Commonwealth countries have, right? But if you think about diversification, it's a tricky thing. I don't think anybody in the world really has achieved it. Those who have it had it from the beginning. From the beginning, they had different aspects of the economy that were performing in different ways. The idea of diversification, as we know it, so I'm explaining it because sometimes we use a word, but we don't get into it to think about what it means. Diversification, as we know it, based on oil and gas, in the literature, is really about getting more value off of the oil and gas assets. So instead of just producing it out of the ground, you go into the downstream value chain so that you produce petrochemicals, maybe plastics, whatever.
So that's one aspect.
But that's what diversification means when you are a fossil fuel economy. Because the other part of it, which is investing in other aspects of the economy to create other economic engines other than the oil and gas sector, means investing in usual things, education, housing, health, etc., infrastructure, etc., all of which we have done. We did those things. My personal belief is that you have to believe in yourself, right? And we know what the books say. We know what the theories are. We can explain them. We can do them in exams and stuff. But at some point, you kind of have to step out of that and get into reality. And the reality is that as a people, we have to believe in ourselves. We have to have a sense of what a good quality of life is and just do it. So one of the things that is a pet peeve of mine, and this, I'm tempted to say it doesn't really have anything to do with energy or sustainability, but I think it really does. We need to see ourselves on television, on the radio, in businesses, in everything. We need to be able to see people that look like us, Caribbean people, doing the things that everybody else in the world does. We cannot just consume everything from outside. So something like Carnival, for example, that is ours, that has always gone on in a way that, yes, the government provides money, but the reality was that Carnival would have always gone on regardless of how much or when the government provides the subvention, because it is part of what we are. And somehow, at the nation level, we don't have a confidence in that as being something of value. But yet, it is our identity. And that right in there is an intrinsic value that shouldn't have to be proven because it's there. And it's that same mindset that I think we need in every aspect of our economy, to just do what we do, but do it well and make it work. And in an energy transition, or if you look at the bigger picture, a sustainability transition, because what's happening is that the sustainability issue has come to the fore completely, so that there's almost nothing you can do on this planet right now if you don't have a sustainability focus, because there's just so much that needs to be done that is kind of impossible to move forward with if you don't consider the environment and the social impact. So that the scenario that we're in will probably polarize the world. It will probably, because even right now with the pandemic, we can't travel as freely, all this type of stuff. So it's going to set up trade barriers. It's going to set up regions of the world that are, probably self-contained, a little more self-contained. And so countries like ours that have a habit of importing culture, the culture of all the different things that we bring in, are going to have a serious problem. We're going to be looking our own lack of confidence in ourselves in the face. But that is the key, I think, to creating the future that we want. So it's not just for the biggest companies out there in the world to do their thing and we sit back and wait to see what they'll do. But we also need to be thinking about the kind of world that we want to live in right here in Trinidad and Tobago, right here in the Caribbean, and being who we are and having that confidence in it to make it real. Because we have the skills, we have the talent. We did everything the diversification says we're supposed to. We invested in the housing, education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. So everything is there. What's missing is the human elements. We have to do it. We have to choose a more sustainable future, not the import business.
Yes, we have done a good job in terms of diversifying within the energy sector. We have the downstream petrochemical industry, but we see that model is also in jeopardy right now. And I mean, there's an argument that those plants were built with a certain lifespan, which we have exceeded. We see that there has been a gradual build-up to this high level of awareness and activism around climate and environment, and particularly youth activism, particularly among Generation Z and millennials, who are inheriting this damaged planet, this warming planet. So countries and now companies we are seeing are under pressure to do more and to account for their contribution to the climate crisis. So now in 2020, we have companies such as BP, Shell, Total, Eni, Repsol. They have all set targets of net zero emissions by 2050, and also to increase their low carbon investment and renewables capacity. So first of all, what does it mean for an oil and gas company to become net zero?
So the oil and gas companies, if you look at how much they're actually spending on diversifying the types of energy that they're participating in, that's renewable, alternative energy, whatever you want to call it, it's only a small percentage of their total spend. Now, their total spend has decreased because when you had a good outlook for oil demand, they would have invested more in proving up reserves. Because the thing is, if you want your company to be producing however much oil in terms of market share in 15 years, it means you have to have an eye on those reserves now. You have to at least know where it is you might have an idea that you're going to be trying to produce from, right? So there will be territory that you maybe have an eye on. You do, of course, you don't have even probable reserves yet. You just have an idea maybe from the maps that, okay, it might have this here, it might have that there, right? But you have to kind of see it from before, from a few years well before, because it takes time to kind of get the okay to go ahead and start doing some exploration. And then it's going to take time to develop the field. And then it's going to take time to bring things up to production, etc. And then in between all of that, you have to get investment decisions, which means you have to have an outlook, right? So they have to do these things years in advance, which is why it does not behoove us to have only 5 to 10 years that we're thinking about oil and gas, right? Or in terms of what we're going to do. We have to have a longer term horizon. But because the companies do this, they have to decide where to allocate money. So they may be allocating less towards proving up reserves that they don't think they might need. Because if you make the investment and then the oil demand really does drop as drastically as you think, then you're left with stranded assets. And that does not help you to provide a return to your shareholders because it's assets that you cannot monetize. So then what they have to do is reallocate the money to the activities that will provide a good return to shareholders, which is increasing your operating margins, which means making your company, the operation of your company, way more efficient. And that will include digitization, or include, reducing waste. And of course, you want to hit like your climate targets to participate in the ongoing discussion about climate change, right? Which means reducing your CO2 emissions. But alongside all of that is your actual move from being a company that is heavily oil and gas to alternative sources of energy, if you think that's what people want. Now, how much you invest in that are going to be linked to how much demand you think there's going to be from that, your own capability to fill it, and how lucrative you think it's going to be. Does it suit the capabilities you have? Because it's not an easy thing to transform a company to something else. Whatever company is good at, that it makes its money doing, to give that up to go into unexplored territory and try and figure out how to do well in that market, especially if you were doing well in a previous market, that is high risk. Your company could perish doing that. And so what you're seeing is the actual investment that they're making in alternative energy is still very small compared to what they're making in their traditional business. So their view is a long-term view. But what they're doing, and this is marketing now, they've made investment, even if it's just, 4% of their budget, which might be up from 1%. Maybe it used to be 1% and now maybe for some of them it's 4% of the budget. Still tiny, right? But if you put the focus on that and you put it in numbers, so you see how much billion it is. Most of us will never see $1 billion in our lives, right? So if you hear, $55 billion is being allocated to clean energy investments from a particular company, it's exciting. It sounds like something big is happening. And it is big for the company because they weren't doing that before. But let's think about realistically the energy economic link. The money you spend on an energy system is going to end up as the energy that actually enters the system and then creates the economic activity. And most of it is still around fossil fuels. And the reason is we do not have a killer app. I do not give the companies wrong. I think that's what you're supposed to do, because whatever you focus on is how people are going to think. And these oil and gas companies, in the face of energy transition, cannot be going on and on about they don't think it's going to happen. They think, the peak is way off after 2050, blah, 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 because it makes them look like the villain. What you actually have to do is say, okay, we hear you and you're right. And we think the peak is already gone. And furthermore, we're going to invest in this, that, and that. And now it changes the narrative and they're no longer the bad guy. They are the ones that are fully on board with transition and trying to make the world a better place. And now you can continue with your business as usual, because the influence of social media is making all of this happen. Because whatever you say now can ripple right around the world. It's not just like a little beat on CNN. it's in the hands of real people on Facebook, on Instagram, on whatever, that everybody can see. And so you have to get that branding very, very correct. And that's what I think is happening. So all this net zero is a nice branding word, but it can't be net zero unless they actually fully switch to other types of energy, which is a completely different business model. Nobody's going to do that overnight. I think we're actually looking at two scenarios, right? On the one scenario, and I'm going to use the science fiction prototype in here, right? Mm-hmm. On the one hand, you have the matrix. The matrix is not what you want. If we live in any matrix, we'd all rather be asleep, right? Because that's like a terrible dystopian future. But on the other hand, you have Star Trek, in which the world is a better place, everybody's working together for good, all that types of stuff, right? In the Star Trek version, you have a global economy that is flourishing, that there is more than enough energy for everybody. It comes from more diverse sources, and there is way more clean, renewable energy in the mix. And fossil fuels form an increasingly smaller and smaller and smaller part of that energy mix. So we all have nice, clean fuel, nice, clean air to breathe, good jobs for everybody because we are all using energy, and therefore the demand is there. And once the demand is there, the jobs are going to be there, and the jobs are going to pay well and all that kind of stuff, right? That is a wonderful future. The other side of it is the matrix, in which you couldn't figure out the sustainability transition, continued using fossil fuels, and overshot the 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius target. You destroy the planet. We continue to use the fuels because that's all we could do, except, everything was much, much harder to do. And so the decline that the companies were seeing all the time just continued. The operating margins got tighter and tighter. Eventually, it just consolidated into a few big companies that do, God alone knows what, I guess, just keep us basically surviving, right? It's not a good future. But this is the point at which we kind of have to make that decision on how to change. And it's, I don't know, I think the pandemic, it's spoken of a lot of times as something that is kind of helping us to reset. Mm-hmm. But I don't know as yet if it's a positive reset, that moves us more towards the Star Trek scenario or the Matrix scenario. Reason really? Being that, yeah, because you don't know what's really happening, I honestly think the fossil fuel companies are doing what they should do, but they are protecting their territory. They're changing the marketing story, but their territory is being protected. And I think we're gonna see fossil fuels continue to be in the mix for a long time because that's what the numbers show. If you really just look at the numbers, that's what it is. I think they are increasing the use of renewable and alternative energies, and I think that will continue to happen. I think that we will continue to see more and more different types of fuel entering the energy mix. And if economies recover, right, this is the tricky part, because the fact that we're seeing a pandemic, so we're talking about COVID-19, but what we're forgetting maybe is that the past couple of years, we were just seeing all kind of diseases popping up. We saw Zika, we saw swine flu, we saw SARS, we saw Ebola come back. We saw all kinds of things that we didn't really expect, right? And we didn't really take them on until COVID actually hit us here in Trinidad so we could experience it personally. But it was happening. And just because COVID-19 is here, it doesn't mean other diseases aren't popping up. Mm-hmm. It's just that COVID-19 is taking up all of the radar. So that if you just be realistic with yourself, what do you think, we're not going to see any more diseases come up? Or any other problems surfacing because of climate change? And as these problems show up, what happens? Does the economy continue like normal, or do parts of it start to contract? And if they contract so that the demand is not there, then where's the incentive to switch to other kinds of energy? Because if the demand is not there, why are you creating more energy? The price, if you do it, the prices of energy will just go down, 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 down. And when that happens, where are the jobs?
But
we're stuck in this cycle. Yeah.
But as a counter to that, when you look at, let's take BP as an example, when you look at their outlook, well, first off, they have 3 scenarios. rapid transition, net zero, and business as usual.
Yeah.
And with the rapid and net zero, they forecast a very aggressive decline in demand for oil.
Yeah.
So I guess that is what is driving the projections for
Of course.
renewables. But
Yes, of course.
again, these are three scenarios. So it would be interesting to see if this net zero drive is anything more than good marketing.
Oh, I think it's much more than good marketing. I think what is the underlying issue is that we really are entrenched in a fossil fuel system. And as I pointed out in the beginning, we don't have a killer app for energy. And until we do that, fossil fuels will most likely remain in the mix unless you have these knock-on effects of climate change that destroy demand, like how the pandemic has really affected the demand.
Well, I
Right? So that
think
if
that is happening.
yeah.
That
So
is,
this is probably not the last thing we'll see. We'll probably see more things happening because of climate change that affect demand. And as that continues to go on, you have a case for the energy pie, if you want to call it that, not really getting bigger and fossil fuels getting smaller in that whole mix, because that's what would make it possible, right? That the effects of climate change really do hit the energy demand, specifically the fossil fuel demand, very hard. The thing is, it's not a fun world to live in. That's what bothers me.
why you say it's not a fun world to live in?
Well, do you want to be stuck at home forever, just talking to everybody on the computer?
That's the thing about the pandemic, is that those other climate impacts tend to be restricted to a particular region or
Yeah.
location, but this pandemic was global, so everyone felt it.
Yeah, and that was because of the connectivity of the world. And
Right.
and that's why we're at this point where we're talking about sustainability in a big way, because the world became so connected that everybody feels everything. Even if you don't realize that's what's going on, underlying everything is that interconnectedness. Now, the pandemic is causing a bit of that to be reset because I think the trade patterns are going to be adjusted. But
Definitely.
but certainly because of social media, we're all connected to each other to see what's happening all around the world and to be almost experiencing it just as it happens. The things like all the diseases that we've seen, not just COVID-19, because we've seen diseases come up in the last couple of years. We've seen Ebola come back, for example, right? It's not a coincidence. When you have changes in how you use land and how you use space, when you start to reach the limits of what is reasonable to do, you start to change patterns, not only in the weather, but also in terms of which species interact with each other. So, for example, an animal that may have been a reservoir for a particular disease and may have been isolated to a particular area, if you have deforestation, you now maybe have people coming into contact with that disease now. And then because we're all connected, because there's so much trade, so much consumerism, that the disease spreads.
Yeah.
You can have, for example, the weather situation where because the localized climate changes, certain species that would have lived somewhere else before now are able to be comfortable in a new place where they impact people maybe in a negative way. Or maybe they are impacted and it affects the whole ecosystem, right? But all of these effects, right, they add up. So, for example, we've seen the hurricane patterns change in this part of the world, right? We've seen the US be hit with hurricanes that have been devastating in a way that we really did not see in the past. And what I'm saying is, a world in which we don't address the sustainability issue is likely a world that's going to have more of these types of disasters, whether it's a disease, whether it's a weather pattern that creates some kind of severe storm, or any number of things that we're not aware of. And that's just ecologically, right? Fires, droughts, whatever. So that this whole sustainability issue and dealing with climate change, we are seeing effects of climate change everywhere and in every area of life. We may not necessarily be making the link and realizing that that's what's happening, but it is. So I'm saying that in a world in which we are dealing with these effects of climate change, it's not going to be a comfortable world to live in. So that, yes, these negative events like pandemics, storms, wildfires, droughts, whatever, can happen that cause a destruction of demand in fossil fuels that allows new space for alternative and renewable and cleaner energies to come in, the reality is that we're not living in a world that we want to live in. So it's not going to be an easy transition. The time for an easy transition is behind us now. And so we're really at that juncture where we have to decide who we want to be. And to me, that is a Matrix versus Star Trek scenario, because one is a slightly easier path. It's not really easy because it's going to be horrible, right? Like, who wants to live in this dystopian future? But that's what will happen if we don't take action. The other one is much, much harder, because as the climate change issues start to come to the fore, I think we're going to have, if we continue to have more disease outbreaks, if we continue to have hurricanes and, other bad weather patterns, wildfires, etc., all those things affect economic activity, and then you tend to get civil unrest. And once you have a situation where that happens, it is very difficult to kind of get things back under control again. So while the clean energy is being created and that new system is developing, it's not an easy time. And that's fundamentally what a transition is. It's more than just, how are we going to make money, considering that, we depend on oil and gas. It's all holding the fabric of society together through a major change. And so you see, right now, there's a lot of talk about wellness and mental health, because this is a very difficult time, to make these changes, to work from home, to be a bit more isolated than you used to have your pattern broken of how you would deal with the various stresses. Like, you can't just go out and lie with your friends or go shopping and have a drink or whatever. It's uncomfortable now. And we don't know how much of that is coming. Yeah. And we don't really have a plan for how to deal with it, because most of the talk has been about certain types of businesses and trying to keep them afloat and trying to move them to being more digital.
Yeah, more of the same.
Yeah.
But as cliche as it sounds, we are in the new normal.
Yeah, we are. Well, I don't know if normal is the right word for it, because I wouldn't like to see it stay this way.
Yeah. So in light of all that we discussed today, I would like to, as we wrap up, I'd like to bring it home in terms of your outlook for our, I would say, local and regional energy space.
I think we have a lot of potential that is untapped, but I do think that we are in a good position. I know many people won't agree with me, but the reason I say this is because as these demands for international oil companies to continue to provide returns to their shareholders during this transition, the pressure of doing that means that whereas in the past they may have looked for greener pastures, the focus, I think, is going to be a lot more on getting the most value of what you already have. There's a saying that a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and I think all of the oil companies are going to see that. And what that means is an environment like ours, in which we have, a stable government, we have, a history of honoring contracts, that type of stuff. We have good relations with international companies, etc. I think bodes very well for us, because it means that when they are looking at which places are already in their portfolio that they should maybe double down on and make their mark there, I think Trinidad will continue to be one of those places. But it's something that we should not take for granted, because it is part of our value proposition to the world, and certainly to the energy world. We are, however, at a point where we have to decide how we want to participate in the energy system of the future, where we think we can play. Trinidad and Tobago is a small provider, right? So I think that's a good position to be in this environment. Because if we were big, if we were, say, Russia, you have a lot of oil and gas. You think some of it might end up being stranded, especially the oil. The gas is a much cleaner fuel, so that should be fine. But you have a lot of oil that you think could be stranded. Who are you going to sell it to? But a smaller player can always find a buyer, because you're not asking them to buy the whole mother load. You just have a little thing that you just need to get to market. So I think that, first of all, is very good. Well, secondly, because the first part is, I think companies are going to want to, that have assets here, are going to want to get more out of those assets, because that's going to make more sense than trying somewhere new. And that is very good for us because some of the things that are going to happen in the new energy landscape, for example, the development of hydrogen as a fuel,
That's
cannot be
another.
done. Yeah, but things
That's
like
another
that,
one.
everything that's going to happen in the energy system of the future is going to be highly technological. And we are not really a high-tech society. So that to participate in the transition in that way, we are going to have to partner with somebody. So that if the incumbents are here, which I think they will continue to be for certain very strategic reasons, it means that we have the opportunity to stay in the game. But the mistake that we made the last time in terms of not really participating in the technology and kind of leaving that to others, we can't afford to do that anymore. At the very least, we need to control our data. We need to know what it is that we have. We need to understand what is really happening. And I think data collection, it's like a basic skill that any person in any country in the world needs to have at this point. And then in addition to that, there is, I think, the need for producer economies like ours to also, in terms of maximizing the value that we get from the fossil fuels that we have so that they do not become stranded, we need to shift what it's used to do. So any fossil fuels we have, whether it's oil or gas, should be allocated to the highest value uses. And in order to do that, we need to invest more in energy efficiency and certainly in renewable energy so that we're not using the precious fossil fuels to those lower value uses. And that requires financing. So it requires thinking about some other things. There's financing available from multilaterals to do that. Of course, it comes with some strings. And there are ways that we could do stuff like that locally. For example, in other countries, they have what's called in the US a renewable portfolio standard, for example, in which the government can require companies to install a certain amount of energy efficiency or renewable energy over a particular period of time, and then compensate the providers that install these services for them. And you can route it so that the compensation comes from a tariff on the energy bill, right? But that's something that requires not just the government to go forward in that kind of policy direction, but to also be collaborative with TNTech and others in order to make that happen. Because that kind of energy system requires a lot more collaboration across different state entities than we've seen in the past, right? So for example, with COVID-19, so there are those types of gaps, but you can only close them when you're aware of the problem that you really want to solve. And in the energy sector, to participate in the new system, we're going to need to do quite a bit of that. I think the outlook is very good. I think there are a number of business models that will emerge in the new energy system globally out of the transition. And it's going to be important for us to decide where it is that we want to play in that. I think I read a study some time ago, and at the time they were talking about 8 different types of business models. And I could have seen at least 4 of them that Trinidad and Tobago could play in, especially if we had the financing. And I think based on the level of foreign direct investment, I think is going to continue to be here, that it is possible for us to pivot in any of those directions. The thing is, with any change, you can't worry about what you're going to lose, because if you're only looking back, there's not going to be opportunities created in the past. The past is what it is. You can learn from it and know that certain mistakes were made that you will never allow to happen again. But the future creates so much possibilities. And that's where I think we need to be looking. And I think we need to be excited about this time, because if you look at the landscape of what's happening. Yesterday, I looked at the investor conference for a company in the US, Ballard Power Systems, who is doing a lot of things with hydrogen fuel cells. And that was very valuable to look at, because a company like that is thinking about where they're going to be in 30 years. So it gives you a good look at what their thinking is around how these new electrified energy systems are going to be. And so just looking at that, this is an investor conference. And you can see where new industries, new products, new services are likely to be created. And those are the spaces that we need to be thinking in our state enterprises, in our private energy companies, in our service companies in the energy sector, etc. Because the sustainability issue is going to be so pervasive that if you don't think about it as a company, you're not going to be able to participate in the value chain. Because chances are, your biggest client, if you are a service provider, right, in the energy sector, traditional energy contractor, chances are your biggest provider is looking to see how they can make their business more sustainable. But they may not ask you upfront while they were strategizing. They might ask you after they figured out their strategy. And then they come to you and say, well, what are you going to do?
Right.
And then if you don't have something or reasonable response to give them about how you can help them to hit their sustainability goals, and this doesn't just apply to energy, it applies to any sector that you're in. If you as a service provider, as a contractor, it doesn't matter what it is you provide, if you cannot say to your client right now, this is how I can help you meet your sustainability goals, you better believe that the day will come that they will ask you that question, and then they'll just move on to another provider. And that provider may not come from this part of the world, and therefore you're left out of the game. And that's what we have to do. All of us need to think realistically about what we offer and how we can make it more sustainable, and how we can help our clients and our customers meet their own sustainability targets, because that whole value chain is going to be affected. And if you don't participate in it, you're going to be left behind. And I think if we just do that and really think about the opportunities, observe the system, think about how it will really work, how these new forms of energy will be deployed, how they're going to affect or create new value chains, what kinds of goods and services will be needed to be provided to support these new industries. That's where the ideas are going to come from. And that's where the new opportunities are going to come from. A new industry being created is a very exciting thing, and it creates a lot of opportunity for the first movers. So I think this is a really good time for us, and we just need to get in the mindset that this is going to be exciting and get on board with it.
Yes. So Nneka, I want to thank you for joining me on the podcast and for this very in-depth discussion around the energy transition and the implications both globally and locally. And we touched on so many good points in terms of first movers versus late adopters, the Matrix versus Star Trek. And definitely that we should strive to be data-driven and have control over our data, so that would enable us to make better decisions about the future that we want.
Yep, indeed.
So Nneka, if persons want to access your consulting services, where can they connect with you?
The easiest way to connect with me is probably via LinkedIn. You can look for me, Nneka Matthews. And you can also send me an email, nneka.matthews@gmail.com.
So if you enjoyed this episode, please rate and leave a review. Connect with the Climate Conscious podcast on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Thank you for listening. Bye.